Hi again. Well, I'm back, and this is, as I mentioned in my intro, to learning and behavioral medicine and psychosomatic medicine just yesterday. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what I consider to be the missing link, okay, between the mind and the body, okay? It became such a fascinating area for me to try to figure out how the mind actually exercises control over one's own body that I really spent a good deal of time moving my thoughts and experimental interests into this field. Okay? How does the mind actually empirically, where do you see the link here? Where do you see it between what you call the mind and physical function? Well, we got to take a look at nothing that is really tangible that you can pick up and say, there it is. It is actually a process that interested me. And it is how we learn, okay? Now, if you go back into the library of videos that I've provided for you and look through that series on classical conditioning, Pavlovian conditioning, and operant conditioning, I'd like you to review those. So if you have any question about what I'm talking about here, that'll give you a foundation. By the way, speaking of talking, I just wrote that on the board before I came into the classroom here. Okay, I took a look at that. I'm having trouble reading it. Okay, and it just occurred to me that what I actually wrote for yesterday's intro, I took a look at it. I couldn't read it either. So, wait a minute. If you have trouble reading what I just wrote yesterday, give me a call, will you? I've told you how to reach me. Say, why don't you learn how to write? Or what is that on the board? Okay, I'll be glad to get back to you. Anyway, what this says, believe it or not, is conditioning, learning, classical, and operant. Okay, operant, instrumental conditioning, classical, and Pavlovian conditioning. Okay, real interesting, very quickly. I would just want to review it and then move on to what I think is something really important. It is a derivative of this, okay? Now, remember, I said before there's an unconditioned stimulus, UCS, which always leads to an unconditioned response, UCR. What is that? Okay, in Pavlov's laboratory, it was meat powder, which always, the unconditioned stimulus, that dog that was in a harness was interested in eating meat, and when meat was produced, it would always salivate, okay? No big deal, you kind of expect that, huh? However, in a stroke of genius and insight, after watching this animal, as we do all the time. Remember, this has been going on for eons, and nobody's paid a whole heck of a lot of attention to the behavior of these animals. And Pavlov said, "Oh, that's kind of interesting. If I ring a bell in close association with that meat, that it should precede the presentation of meat by, in this case, half a second. Okay, real quick. So very close, what you call temporal contiguity. And that is the relationship, the time relationship between the two, temporal contiguity. You begin to see something really interesting. So what he did was this. Once again, he called this a conditioned stimulus, which is a bell after repeated pairings, it occurred just before the presentation of the meat powder. Bill, meat powder, Bill, meat powder. No, okay, do that 10, 20, 30 times, and guess what? Do not present the meat powder, okay? Which normally produces salivation. So what happens? Now remember, this dog, you could have rung that bell for the rest of the dog's life and he never would have salivated to it until it became associated with that unconditioned stimulus. Now, what happens is that unconditioned stimulus the conditioned stimulus now produces a conditioned response. That is a learned response. It's actually a new behavior that this animal never exhibited. He tended to respond to the bell in the same fashion, almost the same fashion he would the meat powder. So that is really a new element in his behavioral repertoire. And we call that learning. That's learning. And you repeat that over and over again, and you'll notice that that animal will continue to produce a salivary reaction to the bell. Notice the animal's in a harness, and he is being presented with some kind of array of stimuli here. And he really can't walk around. He's stuck there. And the whole idea was to try to train a salivary response to a bell. They accomplished that. And that kind of a learning paradigm is called classical conditioning. Now, the salivary response, the salivary system, is operated by the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system. You know, you have two major branches of a nervous system. I'm sure you all know this. You know, most of you have taken a course or two or more in college. You probably got this in high school as well. So we have the autonomic nervous system, which is the vegetative nervous system, the automatic nervous system. It's automatic, vegetative, and it is unable to, how would I say, be very sensitive to the outside world. It operates automatically and controls everything under the cortex and all the organ systems. You don't even know it's operating. And it operates quite independently of what we're doing here. I can raise my arm. My heart rate may vary a little, largely because of the exercise energy output, but it's a self-regulatory, fixed. From the Greeks to contemporary medicine, physicians are taught, physiologists are taught, that the autonomic nervous system is not something you can train because it just is self-regulatory and insensitive to environmental stimuli to a large degree because it is self-regulatory. Okay, what does that have to do with anything? Well, I want you to take a look at what B.F. Skinner, Thorndike, Watson, early days, and all of their disciples to this day, have noticed, okay? And Skinner himself said, that's too simple an explanation to explain all of learning, okay? And he was right. Because what he developed, thanks to Thorndike to begin with, but he carried it well beyond that, okay, is operant conditioning or instrumental conditioning. And in this learning paradigm, the animal's free. He's not in a harness. He's not in a harness. He's just walking around, okay, doing whatever he does, you know. And guess what? Depending upon the behavior he is performing at the time, if it produces consequences that are positively reinforcing or negatively punishing, that free-ranging behavior will be strengthened. Now, you remember that pigeon display of mine over there? It was excellent artwork, huh? Okay, cool. You got the idea. Pigeon running around in BF's Skinner box. Okay, and finally, you know, he realizes if he pecks that little paddle right there, a food pellet drops. Okay, and before you know it, the pigeon isn't running around anymore. He's just going straight to the food dispenser and hitting that thing. Okay, doing just like my rats in that maze that I described to you. Okay, that is instrumental conditioning. That study I told you about and Skinner's pigeon. Free-ranging behavior, the consequence of the act that the individual commits, will actually shape that behavior. If it is positively reinforcing, that behavior will tend to occur again and again and again. In the beginning, as long as it's reinforced. And then, even when it's not reinforced in the beginning, if you reinforce it every other time or change the ratio to a variable ratio where it's 1 in 3, 1 in 5, 1 in 20, 1 in 12, etc., you develop a behavior, operant behavior, that is really well cemented. Well cemented. By the way, depending upon the ratio of reinforcement, that behavioral pattern will last the rest of that animal's life. Deep-seated habits, okay, that resist extinction. Now, you can produce autonomic. This is, by the way, I want to take one step back. This is operated by the central nervous system. Remember, the central nervous system, unlike that one, is controlled by the cortex, the spine, and the nerves that control the striated muscles. Yeah, that's the central nervous system. That's how we're able to move. The central nervous system gives us the ability to move like that. The autonomic nervous system does not give your stomach the ability to shift its position in the thoracic cavity, or the abdomen, or the lungs, or the pancreas cannot shift around like your fingers. Autonomic nervous system is not built that way, okay? What does all that mean? Well, one of the things we've learned over the years, and fairly early on too, compared to where we are today, is that if you condition a organ system that is supported by the autonomic nervous system, and not just the salivary glands, but other autonomically supported organ processes, the organ learns fairly quickly using classical conditioning. Okay? You can actually train the organ to respond to various kinds of stimuli by producing anxiety, producing an elevation in heart rate, tachycardia, okay, a wide range of cardiovascular disorders. You can actually train the stomach to produce too much acid. You can produce the gastrointestinal tract to produce either too little motility, too much motility, when I say train, these organ systems are sensitive to the stress mechanism of the body, okay? And they react accordingly, okay? That's the autonomic nervous system. You're not going to find a stomach getting out there and walking around like that pigeon and all of a sudden trying to find that food tray and then hitting it, and somehow it's changing the function of the stomach. Okay, motility, hydrochloric acid production, whatever it is. Okay. Stomachs don't do that. They just respond to the hormonal and sympathetic discharge, neurological discharge, and react in some very specific ways. Okay? Not here. Central nervous system, as it turns out, has a wide array of options available to it. You know, just take a look at what you can do physically here, okay? And all of the activities that you engage in, all of the things that you think about, the wide array of abilities to think about things, complex analyses, physical achievements, are all central nervous system. And they are free-floating, and you actually learn how to do these things by trial and error and by positive or negative reinforcement. Real interesting. When you can establish a behavioral pattern in the central nervous system through operant conditioning, remember, operant conditioning here is, it's a stimulus response. Like this is a stimulus response SR theory. This is really a response, and that is whatever you do to, that is your response in the environment, you get reinforced for it. So it's an RR theory. SR theory, stimulus response, but it is really an RR. You have to respond in order to experience the consequences of your behavior in the environment. Okay, get it? Otherwise, you can never find the doorknob to get out, okay? So to speak. Okay, what is so important about all of this? Because as it turns out that we learn differently inside. The organ systems, autonomically based, actually learn best, acquire habit patterns best using classical conditioning. The striated musculature and the central nervous system learn best through instrumental conditioning. Okay, so what? We got two ways to learn inside of our body. The autonomic nervous system, classically conditioned, and we learn habits, emotional habits that way. I'm afraid of snakes, I'm afraid of freeways, whatever it is. That emotional reaction you experience out there is classically conditioned, okay? Here is something really interesting. Habits that are formed in the autonomic nervous system this way really last for a while, but they don't last for a lifetime. They tend to weaken and extinguish relatively rapidly over time compared to responses, behavior that's learned in the central nervous system. These behaviors can last a lifetime. Pay attention to what I just said. These behaviors are very capable of being maintained throughout your life. These behaviors tend to be acquired